Hi there, everybody. Thank you for attending this event. We are so excited you could all make it tonight. This is a topic that's very important to all of us, and we are thrilled to see that's so important to all of you too. My name is Zachary Pate, and here to the left of me is Taryn Muldoon.
Hi there, folks. It's so good to see all of you here. We are the Annapolis Valley Bat Box Project, and we are a nonprofit-making organization with the goal to support local bat populations by raising awareness about bats, providing educational programming, and building and distributing bat boxes.
We operate over a fairly wide range, so if you are interested in supporting bats by having a bat box on your property, please contact us and we can get the process started. Our contact information will be posted in the comments. There will also be a brief question and answer period at the end of the webinar, as well as a survey, which will be made available once the event has finished. We would love it if you would fill it out. It gives us valuable information for next time.
So we're just about to get started, but before we do, we'd like to say a couple of thank yous. So big thank you to our grantor, Rising Youth, to our community partners, CECNB's Youth Partnership Initiative, and to the Canadian Wildlife Federation. Also, a huge thank you to our volunteer bat box builder, without whom this project could not have been possible. Thank you as well to the rest of our bat team and the amazing speakers we have here tonight. And now, without further ado, welcome to our bat education webinar, bringing together bat experts from Nova Scotia and beyond. Our first speaker will be Hugh Broders. Dr. Hugh Broders is an evolutionary ecologist and professor of biology at the University of Waterloo, whose primary research focus is on the demography, life history, and migratory movements of bats. He first started working with bats in Atlantic Canada in the fall of 1998 and has been at it ever since, having worked through all of the 4 Atlantic provinces.
And they are in the order Chiroptera, and Chiroptera stands for hand wing. So you can see on this animal here on the screen, its left wing is outstretched in this photo. In the top, you can see its thumb here. I think you should be able to see my cursor. And then you see each of its other 4 digits here that are elongated. So the Latin name for bat basically means hand wing. And so they've got what's called a patagium, which is this membrane that stretches between these digits that make up their wing. We're learning a lot about bats every single day. They are a remarkably diverse group of animals. And in 2001, a group of authors looked at the scientific literature to make an estimate of how many species that there are out there. How many species of bats are there in the world? So in 2001, there was an estimate of about 1,000. So in this case, 1,001 recognized species of bats, or Chiroptera, there's that word right there, hand wing. There are 1,000 different species of bats recognized in the world. If we, why is this doing this? If we fast forward to 2015 here, this is an abstract from a conference that Nancy Simmons and Andrea Serenello published for the North American Society for Bat Research. And in this, Nancy is the authority on bats and taxonomy in the world. And she said then in 2005, there were approximately 1,116 different species of bat. So already up an extra 115 different species in only 4 years. In August of 2015, that number has risen to about 1,349. So approximately 350 more over a 15-year period. And I can tell you that now that number sits at over 1,400 species. So every week or every month, there are new species of bats being recognized, and the diversity within that group of animals is remarkable. Within mammals, they are second only to the rodents in species richness. They make up about 20 20 or 25% of the mammalian species richness on the planet. And within the group, there's, as I said, remarkable diversity. We have these fishing bats here with these really, really large feet. And basically they fly over the surface of the water, trying to detect minor ripples in the surface of the water with their echolocation pulses. Those ripples are often caused by fish swimming near the surface, and they can basically trawl the fish from the surface of the water with their large feet. We have a very large number of nectarivorous bats or nectar feeding bats, including this Glossophaga here from Belize, which is in Central America, an immense number of other fruit-eating bats of various types and sizes. And then a remarkable number of insect-eating bats as well. So within the group of bats, there are a large number of different species with very different life history strategies, but all remarkable in their own right. This is a photo here I took in Nova Scotia in, I think it was around 2003 or 2004. This is my thumb in the screen, and this is a little brown bat. There's a couple of things I want to point out in this photo. So this used to be, maybe still is, we don't know, the most abundant bat in Nova Scotia. It's the little brown bat. It's the one that you would see flying around your backyard and over ponds for the most part, in and around Nova Scotia and throughout Canada for that matter. So this is my thumb, which is an average sized thumb. And this animal fits very easily on my thumb. The reason why it's sitting there is that it was captured on a very cold evening at the entrance of a cave about a half hour from the valley. And so it was gone into torpid, basically. It's basically shut down and just sat on my thumb. It's a tiny animal. It probably weighed only 7 or 8 grams. But here's the thing. This particular animal could very well be older than many of the people on this call tonight. Now, I can't see any of you, so I don't know the relative ages here, but these animals are capable of living decades in time. The record we have for little brown bat is 34 years. Another thing I want to point out here is that I just have my thumb, there's no gloves, there's no protection, there's no nothing. And when we first started working on bats, I started in the fall of 1998, and we used to capture and handle bats with our bare hand all the time, and it is not a good idea. We got lucky and we never had any problems, but we certainly do not encourage people to handle the bats with their bare hands, even if they are protected from things like rabies, which everyone that works on bats with me do that. This is how it looks more so today. We're wearing Tyvek suits, we're wearing nitrile gloves, and we're being super careful when we handle these animals. A little bit about my research. Again, I don't have much time, but I'm interested in many different aspects of the biology of these animals, from demography and population biology to social biology. And I'm especially interested in understanding aspects of their biology that can help us inform management decisions around these bats. This is Newfoundland here. It is one of my main study sites. It's in Newfoundland. Here's a bat box here in the top left-hand side. Inside these boxes, there are perhaps hundreds of bats. I'll show you a really poor photo here in a minute. But we have these readers that sit on the entrance, you can see here, and we have microchipped a bunch of animals in this particular system so we can track when they come and go from these systems. So this is a look at the bat box from underneath. You see there's a bat here flying away from the box in the evening. And here's this incredibly poor photo that I have But you can see there's hundreds of bats up inside this box. So this photo here is looking up inside the bottom of this box right here. And I know I'm going fast here because I don't have a lot of time. I want to be respectful for the other presenters. This is also a bat from the same study site. It's a little brown bat. It just left the bat box. And what you see in this photo is it has a big round belly. So this is a pregnant female bat. And one of the things I'm interested in is what proportion of the population reproduce each year, what is the probability of survival of those offspring, and the general life history of these animals. So how long do they live? I don't have time to get into a lot of the data, but here are some of the things that I'm interested in. For example, very briefly here, let's look at this graph in the top right-hand side here. In 2012, we tagged 306 of these adult female little brown bats. So in 2012, if you follow my cursor, 100% of them were alive. The next year in 2013, we had about 85% of those individuals still alive. That is a minimum estimate because some of the individuals that we don't record could very well have dispersed away from our study site. And what you see here is that 4 years out in 2015, that number is about 65%. So over 4 years, we got approximately a 35% decrease in survivorship. Now, those are for individuals caught as adults. If you look at the young, for example, in that same year, we caught 47 young of the year, and we were able to track their presence in the study system, which is a minimum estimate of their survival. And you can see 4 years out, the probability that they're still in the system is just under 40%. And so we've got lots of this data now, and what we're going to try to do is try to get a better handle on factors that affect survivorship of within these populations and how it relates to weather and other environmental conditions of that nature. Another thing that I'm really interested in is social biology and how these animals interact with one another. And so this is a network diagram that was produced by students in my lab in the last few days, actually, of relationships among individuals. These are long-lived, highly social animals, and we do not have a good understanding of the nature of that sociality and the benefits of that sociality to these animals. And certainly that's important for our understanding of their biology and to their conservation. In the last couple of minutes here, I want to just point out a couple of things, and this will hopefully lead into Lori Finney's work. But there are two groups of bats that exist in Nova Scotia, one of which are long distance migrants. They fly from Nova Scotia down to southern states, or probably the Central America and the Caribbean. And they are incredibly vulnerable to being killed by wind farms. So this is a wind turbine photo I took in Nova Scotia a few years ago. And if you've got wind farms, this is in eastern Nova Scotia, almost formed like a blanket across the landscape. And when bats are migrating through some of these places that are good for putting wind farms, you find lots of hoary bats, and like this one here, red bats and silver-haired bats that have been killed. And the big problem with this is it's hard to count the number of bats that exist out there, and it's hard to count the number that are killed. And so we do not have a really good understanding of the exact implications of mortality from wind farms on these populations. But anecdotally, from talking with bat researchers across North America, and some analysis at least, it's not looking good for these populations. It seems we are having a big impact on them. The other group of bats are the species of bats that spend the entire year in temperate areas, so they stay all year in Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, there are a large number of abandoned mines, such as this one here, the entrance of this abandoned mine. as well as caves and gypsum and limestone outcrops. And right here, if you can see my cursor, there's an entrance to a cave there that goes all the way under this outcrop. And it's a really important site for bats in Nova Scotia. If you go to this site, if you went to this site prior to about 2010 and you were there in the evening, it might look like this. And if you count in this picture right here, there's something like 12 or 15 bats flying. This picture is the face of that cliff that was in the last picture that I showed you. And if you put up a heart trap, which is what we would do for our studies, you could catch hundreds of bats in a given night. So you can see in this trap right here, I haven't counted them, but there's probably 30 or 40 bats captured in here. White nose syndrome is a disease caused by a fungus. I'm not going to get into it too much, but Lori Finney is going to talk about it a little bit. I just want to point out a couple of things. So these are animals that we have been tracking at Lake Charlotte Gold Mine. This bat in the middle here has the characteristic fungus that's associated with white nose syndrome. It was tagged in May of 2010. This picture was taken in December of 2012. And so it was at least 2 years old. And the numbers of that, this particular site went to 0 within a couple of years. This is the entrance of that same cave that I showed you a second ago with all of the bats in the picture. You can see this is just inside. So here's the cliff face is just outside this opening here. Littered on the floor of this particular cave are all these bats. And this picture here, which represents maybe a square foot, you can see there's carcasses of bats strewn throughout this particular picture. At this particular site, it was our best case scenario for survivorship of bats based on the data that we have. And we had a 99.2% decline in numbers at this particular site. 99% decline. And that was our best case for the data that we have in Nova Scotia. Sorry, this is a little bit of a sad note, but my main study site was at a gold mine not far from Rawdon. We've been tracking it for years and years, and there were 1,200 bats there every single time we went. This was the last bat that I saw in Rawdon. It was April of 2014. I've only been back there once since, because I now live in Ontario, but when I was back there, the number was 0. So this was the last one. And so there's lots of implications, like if there's only one left, is it able to survive? Is it able to reproduce? These are long-lived, highly social animals. So the implications for a severe population decline to the long-term persistence is dramatic. That was a little fast, but I've had the pleasure of working with hundreds of bright, creative, hardworking, passionate students over the years. And this is just some of them, including Laurie Finney, that's here in the top, just off the middle of the screen. And with that, I would probably have gone over a minute or two, and I will turn it over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hugh.
You're welcome.
Our next speaker will be Lori Finney. She is a species at-risk biologist with the Mercy Tubiatic Research Institute, specializing in bat conservation. Over to you, Lori.
Okay, can you hear me now? I was trying to unmute.
Yes, Lori, we can hear you.
Okay, awesome. And can you see me as well?
Yes, we could see you and hear you, Lori. You're good to go.
Perfect. Okay, awesome. So thank you for the introduction. So I have a little bit of experience with bats. I've been working with the Mersey-Tobiatic Research Institute since around 2016, and I recently did my master's with Hugh, researching bats. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about white nose syndrome and bat conservation going on in our region. So some of the early work with bats was just asking basic questions in Nova Scotia that Hugh played a large role in. So these are some of the bats that have been documented in Nova Scotia, and we can kind of separate them into two groups. The first three here being bats that are found year-round in the province, the little brown bat, the northern bat, and then the tricolor bat. And then these other ones on the side are ones that we don't see as much as they migrate, or the big brown bat, the last one, which we don't see as much. But we didn't always know this much information about our bat population and our bat community locally. So it took time for us to figure these things out. Early on, when individuals like Hugh started their work, there wasn't as much attention paid to bats. There just wasn't as much interest, so we just didn't have a good idea about the history of what populations look like in the province. But from some of this work by Hugh and his colleagues and his students, we gained a greater understanding of what bats were more abundant in the province, learning that we were more often seeing the little brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, and the tricolor bat. From the 90s to the early 2000s, there was also more social concern from the public about bats, and this was paired with us finding out more about them and just general concern for biodiversity across the region. And so more people were interested in protecting bats. But around this time, we started seeing some of those photos of what Hugh showed you in Nova Scotia, hundreds and thousands of dead bats in caves. And so this is at a cave in the States, and you can see there's lots of bats laying dead on the ground. And so this is something that researchers working in caves hadn't seen before. So many dead bats with this white fuzzy stuff growing on them. So it was a mystery as to what was going on. And so people like in the bat research community, like Hugh and others, had to figure out why bats were dying and what was going on. And so now today we know this disease as white nose syndrome. The fungus, the scientific name for it is Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which we like to call for short form PD. And so with this fungus, we first started noticing it from cavers and bat researchers in the States around 2005, 2006, 2007. And quickly we had to learn a lot about it. So things that we know now are that it thrives in places where bats like to spend the winter, which are cold and damp climates, such as in caves and mines, and that it's spread primarily through bat-to-bat contact. The troubling part, though, is that it makes bats very sick, and so when it's infecting their skin, and it causes a cascade of physiological responses that are disrupting their ability to spend the winter hibernating. And so from some of these things causing them to be dehydrated, they tend to wake up about twice as often as they normally would if they weren't sick. And so this causes them to not have enough fat to last through the winter and die before it becomes spring. Here is a map of currently where we have documented white nose syndrome in North America. And so if you look closer to New York, you can see the early years where it was first detected and then quickly spread kind of throughout Eastern North America. And then was first documented in Canada and then Nova Scotia during the winter of 2010-2011. Now we're seeing it expand westward. And so over the next decade, we're going to be probably having a very different map that we're all looking at right now. The impact of this disease has resulted it to be named one of the worst wildlife diseases in modern times. This is something unprecedented that we haven't been seeing. And this is because over 7 million bats have died, and that number is probably higher. And not only is it because so many bats are dying, but they're dying quickly. So some sites, after you first see the disease introduced to an area, 90 to 100% of the bats are disappearing. One other thing that we've been able to learn since we first discovered the fungus in North America is that it actually exists in other parts of the world and is not causing mass mortalities where millions of bats are dying. So it's been found in Europe and places like China, and those bats have coexisted with the fungus for supposedly years, whereas our bats here did not evolve with it. Like we just heard, in Nova Scotia, by 2013, most of the bats had died off, with one lonely bat in 2014 in Rawdon. And so this led to the federal and provincial listing of 3 species to endangered. So those main species that we were most often seeing in the province. And today, one of the questions I get asked most often is, how is the bat population doing now? And based on some research by Hugh and some of his other students, we're still seeing low numbers. And so that's one thing I assessed through my master's project, is that looking at what bat activity through acoustic detectors looked like before white nose syndrome to now, and it appears that the numbers are still quite low. So we're seeing less than 10% of the activity of like the little brown bat and the tricolored bat that we would have seen when bat populations were healthy or pre-white nose syndrome at least. Pictured here is one of the nets that was used to capture bats at Kejimkujik National Park in 2019, and aside acoustic activity, the capture rates of bats that we would see was also low. So this is a very devastating and sad story. There's a whole network of scientists around the world working together to try and study this disease and learn more. So there's a lot of effort to understand what treatments we could potentially use to kill off the fungus, or how to alter their habitat, or what different survival mechanisms bats persisting are using to kind of get through the winter. And so this makes a lot of sense, but bats that are fat or have higher fat storages as they go into winter tend to survive better, as they can make it through the winter without starving to death. So other things that researchers have looked into are vaccines and various things. And so regardless of whatever treatment kind of emerges as our solution, or a combination of treatments, all of this is going to take a really long time for us to see bat populations back to the numbers they were, or even stabilized, just because a lot of the bats that are affected are only having 1 pup per year. So there's been a lot of effort in Atlantic Canada by a fleet of researchers. And so aside of these recent capture and acoustic surveys in 2018 and 2019, looking at population trends, the place I work for, the Mersey Tobiatic Research Institute, co-hosted a meeting with Parks Canada through Kejimkujik National Park to understand or to bring together and facilitate knowledge sharing among people who are researching bats, as well as people who are doing outreach for various nonprofits, and as well as working with the government organizations. So the Canadian Wildlife Health Co-operative has also initiated a lot of monitoring efforts that we've partnered with on them. And so you've probably heard of things like the Christmas bird count and the breeding bird survey for birds. And something like that hasn't existed in Atlantic Canada for bats. So we haven't had a standardized program to monitor bats long term. And so this program is being widely used in the States right now, in BC. So they have kind of spearheaded bringing this to Atlantic Canada, to kind of bringing some long-term monitoring in partnership with each province. The other thing that they initiated was a centralized bat hotline that individuals like you can call and ask your bat-related questions, and also report any bats that you see. And I'll post the information for that at the end of my talk. Here I've pictured some photos of that monitoring with acoustic survey. So here is my colleague, Brad, with one of the acoustic monitors. It kind of looks like a game camera. And up here is a file showing what a sound file might look like from a bat. And so we have a few techniques that we use to study bats. And if you heard that, that's what a bat might sound like if we could actually hear their voices. The species that we have locally are emitting sounds above our hearing range, so we have to use this special technology to be able to detect them and study them through their echolocations. So in response to this kind of massive die-off in Nova Scotia and trying to increase efforts to conserve bats, MTRI, the organization I work for, and the province of Nova Scotia, the Department of Lands and Forestry, we teamed up together and developed the batconservation.ca reporting website. And so this was in response to just how quickly bats were dying off and an effort to capture public information about bats. So although we have a hotline from the Canadian Wildlife Health Co-operative, this is one of the early things that existed in response to the die-off of bats. And so I'll have both of that information posted at the end. And so here are some really neat photos of reports that we've actually gotten from Nova Scotians. So the first one was of a bat in Yarmouth County from August 30th, 2019. In the middle, we have a photo of an individual that reported a bat in their patio umbrella in Digby County from August 13th, 2020. The furthest photo on the right is a bat that was found in someone's bathtub, and they called and reported to us, and that was in Yarmouth County in August 2018. And so we've really been able to capture some bats persisting in the province since white nose syndrome. All those reports were within the last couple of years. And so this information we can use to inform research, monitoring, and outreach. And so altogether, we've received over 4,000 reports as of this past week. Aside the species that are affected by white nose syndrome, these are some of the migratory bats that we get here that leave during the winter. And so with those bats, we have the eastern red bat, the silver-haired bat, and the hoary bat. And so these ones are bats that we don't see as often, but through the bat reporting website, we're able to capture more information about those more rare species. You also might be able to tell the bat on the furthest right, the red bat, is a deceased bat. So sometimes we're getting reports of that, and we can connect you with how to get that sample sent away for testing for various things like rabies and white nose syndrome. And this can really give us a better idea of not only migratory species, but our year-round bats and how they're doing. Ultimately, with this information, we want to use these bat reports to work with people like you who have bats on your property to help you monitor them. So we're most often getting reports of people seeing bats at their house, their barn, in bat boxes, buildings, and patio umbrellas. And so we've been able to collect this information and reach out to people and work with them to monitor bats on their property. And although bat populations are low, last year alone, we had over 500 bat reports. So there is some hope, even though the numbers and the populations look pretty low and it's going to take a long time. There's lots of people who are passionate about bats who want to work to see where they're surviving and persisting in the province. So the landowner in the photo on the left-hand side here was in Kings County, and this past summer in 2020, we did a social distanced emergence count at night. So this is where female bats during the summer congregate and have their pups together, and at night they come out to forage. And so during that time when they're exiting at night to go out and find some bugs to feed on, we count them to get an idea of how many bats are living in that place. And so at this family's house, they had 23 bats. The second example is the second photo closer to the left or in the middle. So this individual put up a bat box in around 2009, 2010, and quickly had bats use it that summer. And he estimated around 40 bats living in his bat box. And you can actually see in that photo the guano kind of on the shed down below the box. That pile of black stuff is their feces. And so that's a great indicator of bats using them. And so the last survey we did because of COVID was in 2019 at this landowner's house, and we counted almost 100 bats. So we actually found out he had more bats than he had initially anticipated. So I'm just going to wrap up here. So if you have bats on your property, or if you see a bat, you have a couple of reporting options. So the bat conservation site has been the site I've been talking about, what we've been reporting to. But now that we have a region-wide for the Atlantic provinces, you can call this number, and they also have a source of information to give you about if you have questions about if you have bats in your house and you're not sure what to do about it. General bat biology, up-to-date information about bats and rabies and COVID, and any other concerns or questions that you have. So please check out those resources for your bat-related questions, as well as you can reach out to me to connect you with some of this information, as well as learn more about some of the projects MTR is working on with bats and other species at risk. So I'd like to sign off with thanking some of our partners. So I've worked really closely, again, with Hugh at the University of Waterloo as my supervisor for my master's project. I've worked really closely with Parks Canada at Kijimikujik National Park, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada, the province of Nova Scotia, and the Canadian Wildlife Health Co-operative. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lori. That was a fantastic presentation. We appreciate you being here. Our next speaker will be Dr. Kristen Lear. Dr. Kristen Lear is a bat conservationist with over 12 years of experience working on bat research, conservation, and education projects in the US, Australia, and Mexico. She earned her PhD in integrative conservation from the University of Georgia and is now an endangered species intervention specialist at Bat Conservation International, where she coordinates the organization's Agave Restoration Initiative for pollinating bats in the US Southwest and Mexico. Dr. Lear is also heavily involved in community outreach, leading bat presentations, bat house workshops, and public bat walks. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can see and hear you.
Perfect. I apologize, my internet just cut out right before we started, so hopefully we won't have that happen again, but if I disappear, I will get back on as soon as I can. So thank you, everyone. My name is Dr. Kristen Lear. I am with Bat Conservation International, and I'm going to give kind of a brief overview of bats in general and some of the conservation work and threats that bats face around the world. So first, to start off with the importance of bats and some bat basics. We currently have over 1,400 species now. Hugh talked a little bit about the history of discovering these new species. There's these 1,400 species around the world, and you can see the diversity that exists. There's many different looks, they eat many different things, but in general, they make up about 1 in 5 mammal species. So there's a lot of these species out there. And you may have heard recently in the news, there was a newly discovered species from West Africa that was just announced last week. So we are constantly adding new species to the list and discovering new habitats where these bats are living. And bats do live basically all over the world in all of these orange areas. They live on every continent except Antarctica. So they're basically in all environments except the kind of the extreme polar regions and extreme deserts. And bats really are keystone species. So we can see that one of the main things that bats do is help control insect populations. About 70% of all bats around the world are insectivorous. So they eat things like moths, beetles, and other small insects, and they help serve as biological control agents. Now, I like showing this analogy. It's a fun one for the kids, but even for adults. Some species may be able to eat up to half their body weight or so in insects every night during the summer. So if we had to eat enough quarter-pounder hamburgers to be like a bat, how many would we have to eat? I won't make you do all the math, but about 300 hamburgers or so in one night. So this is an incredible feat that these bats are doing every night and going out when they're eating. So if we look at a colony of bats, one bat can eat about 500 insects per night. This is a rough estimate, maybe fewer, but we're using this as an example. So a colony of about 50 bats, which is a fairly decent colony for a lot of the bats in the US and in Canada, can eat about 25,000 insects per night if they're constantly eating those insects. So a study by Boyles et al. In 2011 extrapolated this and estimated that bats are worth at least $3.7 billion to the US agricultural industry every year. And that's the minimum estimate. So these bats are eating agricultural pests like cotton pests, corn pests, pecan pests, and helping save farmers spraying pesticides, which in the long term saves money. So these bats are really important for agriculture. Another aspect of the agricultural benefits of bats are that bats pollinate over 300 plants worldwide. You can see this bat here, it's got his nose shoved in an agave flower, and the cactus species and many, many other plants around the world. They get covered in pollen and they spread that pollen to different plants and help pollinate those plants. So some of the plants that we know and love, some of our favorite foods are bat pollinated. So things like bananas, mangoes, avocados, cacao, which we use to make chocolate, and my favorite, agaves, which we use to make tequila. So without bats, we wouldn't have any of these things. Now, bats that eat fruit are also very good at spreading and dispersing seeds. So we can see in these pictures here, this bat has a fruit, and they eat the fruit, and they either spit out the seeds or they will eventually poop out the seeds. And then they spread those over large distances and help regrow places like tropical rainforests. And these bats are really good flyers, so they can spread these seeds over fairly large distances. So again, these bats are very important for helping regenerate places like rainforests. Now, within cave ecosystems where a lot of bats roost, the bats themselves obviously produce a lot of guano, and this provides a lot of nutrients for those cave ecosystems, for these invertebrates, and basically are an integral part of that cave ecosystem that would collapse without the bats present. Now, from a person-human perspective, bats are inspiration for many technological and medical advances. You may have heard about the echolocating cane for blind people. You can see that kind of a demo here, that this cane uses echolocation, just like some bats do, and it shakes or vibrates when the cane detects something around it, and then the person will know that there's an object in front of them. We have drones here that are inspired by bat wings and that are shaped like bats and that are much more maneuverable than some of the other drone versions. This picture down here is a picture of a Nectar Bat Tongue. It's a very close-up image, and you can see they have these kind of hairs, they're called papilla, that help absorb and drink up the nectar. And scientists and doctors are using this tongue design as a design for medical instruments for things like arterial surgeries, to get into the arteries and help expand those arteries. And then finally, bats are very, very good at tolerating things like viruses. They don't get sick a lot of times. They don't get sick as often as we do. So there's a lot of work going into thinking about, can we use bats' immune systems, or how they can not get cancer? Can we somehow develop treatments for people to prevent these diseases in the future? So these are just some of the benefits of bats around the world. But unfortunately, bats pretty much everywhere are under threat for many, many different sources. So the IUCN has different categories of threat, but basically with the critically endangered species, there's 24. There's 53 endangered species and 104 bats that are vulnerable. And then there's about 226 species that are understudied or data deficient, which means we just don't know a lot about them. So altogether, that's about a third of bats around the world that are under some sort of threat category or data deficient. And like Lori mentioned earlier, one of the key reasons that these threats are really bad for bats is because they have such slow reproduction. Bats only have one pup per year typically. Some species like this red bat here will have twins or triplets, but for the most part, one pup per year. So if something happens to a colony of bats, it's going to take years for that population to recover. Now, we already talked about some of these threats. Hugh did a great discussion of white nose syndrome and wind energy, and we've had Lori talk about white nose syndrome. And unfortunately, this is a huge threat for North American bats. And I won't go into all the details since we've already covered that. Wind energy, again, Hugh talked about wind energy and what its impacts are in North America. This video, I like, quote unquote, showing just because it shows how this works. It is quite sad, but you can see the bat flying and then getting hit by the blades. So the bats either get hit directly by the blades or they suffer what's called barotrauma, which is when the pressure changes around the blades, they basically get internal organ damage and die from that. So across the wind energy between 2000 and 2012, over 1 million bats are estimated to have been killed by these wind turbines. And in Canada and the US, it's about 24 species of bats that are in some way affected by wind energy. And like Hugh discussed, migratory tree roosting bats are typically the most affected bat species. And so I know Anna in the chat asked about, what's being done to prevent wind energy fatalities. There's a lot of work being done to figure out how can we prevent these bat fatalities while still getting energy from wind, because it's a great source of energy. So one of the things that we're looking at is, when do these bat fatalities occur? So here on the y-axis, we have bat fatalities, and then on the x-axis, we have wind speed. So basically, as the wind gets higher, there's fewer bat deaths. As the wind is slower, lower wind speeds, more bats are hit and die. So this means maybe we can pursue things like curtailment, which is turning off those turbines until the wind reaches a certain speed, so that the blades are not running at those slow wind speeds when the bats are out, but then they don't lose that much power. It's typically about 1 to 3% of the power generation that's lost. So again, this is not always a solution in every situation, and not all companies are going to want to do this, but this is something that we're pursuing and trying to work with the wind energy on. Another thing that could potentially work are things like deterrence, like acoustic deterrence, where you could place a deterrent on the blades or on the turbine, and that would deter the bats from getting close to it. So again, there's a lot of work going on now with how can we scale these up on a large scale with many different companies. Now, habitat loss or modification across the board is a huge issue for bats around the world. And habitat can, of course, include things like roosting sites, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it can also include foraging habitat, so where the bats are feeding from. And in the case of pollinating bats that drink nectar, this is one of the projects that Bat Conservation International is spearheading, is an agave restoration initiative for these endangered pollinating bats in Mexico and the US Southwest. So we're basically trying to counteract the land degradation that's happening, the conversion of agave habitat to things like ranching and agriculture. And we're trying to plant more agaves to feed these bats. And this is what I've been in charge of for the past about 6 months. And it's a really awesome program where we're working with local communities in Mexico, as well as government agencies and industry in the US and Mexico, to plant these agaves for bats, but also for people in Mexico to continue using for their cultural and economic uses. Like I mentioned, habitat also includes roosts. So roost disturbance can be a threat to bat species. And roost disturbance can happen through removal of trees and branches where bats are roosting or have roosted in the past. It can include vandalism from people going into caves and vandalizing or burning out the cave, or even just the mere presence of people can sometimes disturb bats, especially when they're hibernating in the winter. Also, guano mining in some areas. People mine the guano from caves because it's a great fertilizer and it's worth money. But this, again, can be done in a way that disturbs the bats. So it needs to be done in a way that does not disturb the bats. And so part of BCI's work is to protect these roosts. So protecting caves and mines by things like fencing. So you can see putting up fencing around the entrances so the bats can still fly out and fly in, but people can't get in. And we also work with land managers who manage places like forests and trees to try to, again, do this in a bat-friendly way. For example, leaving some older trees up for the bats, because those might be the best roost sites. So again, there's lots of work there with roosts. And then finally, climate change is a big overall issue across the board for bats and wildlife in general. And with bats, one of the main things with climate change is water. So we're seeing increased droughts in a lot of areas. These bats can lose up to 30% of their body weight in water in a night or in an afternoon if they're not getting enough water. So we really need to make sure that there's enough water on the landscape. And this video, you can see the bats are swooping down to drink water from a livestock trough. So, the cattle are drinking from it, but so are the bats. Unfortunately, what happens sometimes is that these bats will fly in and get stuck in the water, and you can see they'll get stuck. And a lot of bats can swim for a period of time, but they can't get out of these tanks. So what some of the efforts that we're doing is to work with land managers to put in these kind of bat rescue mechanisms so that the bats can climb out of these troughs while still getting their water. So again, this is a very simple measure, but something that we're trying to do to provide and make sure that there's water across the landscape for these bats. And in a nutshell, really protecting bats protects us all. We saw the benefits, the immense benefits of bats economically, to our everyday lives, the products we eat and the products we encounter. So if we can protect bats, we protect us at the same time. Thank you all. I know we'll have time for questions, and if you want to learn more about BCI's work, we have our website there. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Our next speaker will be James Paget. James works on various species at risk and biodiversity projects at the Canadian Wildlife Federation, including turtle recovery work, rare species surveys, and bat conservation. James has been leading the way with iNaturals Canada as a way to engage everyday people and researchers in connecting and conserving biodiversity. Take it away, James.
Great, thank you. And I will just get my screen up. And there you go. Just double check, everyone can see that all right? Yeah.
Yes, we can see you and hear
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks. Always good to make sure. Awesome. So there's been some great lead-ins and good discussion so far. So it actually covers some things as well that I can move through. So this is great. So I'm with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. We have a few efforts on the go with bats, and I'm going to just focus on our Bat Box project. And everyone in the Nova Scotia area has the fortune of being somewhere where there's also a Bat Box project on the go led by our hosts, Zach and Taryn. So if you're interested in bat boxes and acquiring one, they're great next people to talk with. So as we've heard, white nose syndrome is the major threat, especially in Eastern Canada, and now moving westward. So we've got a great rundown on that. But not all bats die from white nose syndrome. Some survive. And so what this project is, and what I'm going to talk about is ways to make sure that those ones that survive keep surviving. So in other words, trying to alleviate some of those additional threats that Kirsten really excellently spoke about. So one reason being that very small populations as a result of being decreased from white nose syndrome is that we need to kind of maintain as many of those individuals as we possibly can. Another is, as was mentioned, is that Canadian bats, this disease is novel to Canadian bats, and some of them may show some signs of resistance or that aren't being killed by the disease, and they may be the ones that kind of, they would be the ones that procreate and are a future for the species. So I don't need to get into all these threats because they were really well talked about. The one I'm going to key in on right now is the threat of bat exclusions. So what happens when bats are evicted from a house? So a number of species of bats do roost in homes, and homeowners don't always like that. And so they look to a way to remove the bats and ideally do this in a safe way. The problem being is that, for one, if it's done in the wrong time of year, you can actually trap young pups in the house, and then they would be either trying to find another way out and end up in the living space, or stay trapped in the attic and not survive. The way these exclusions are done, and the way that happens, is because it's usually done with a one-way door. So a single, they find the main entry exit point. A wildlife control company would do this, basically create the way this kind of cloth or screen is looked like. Typically it's actually more of a metal wire, and bats can leave, but they can't get back in. Often these are paired with bat boxes as a way to kind of maintain some habitat or provide an alternate roost site. A problem is that there's so many different styles and designs and placement of bat boxes, and there's research into it, but we don't know on a regionally specific scale what's ideal in some situations. So this is where we're going with our project. A couple of years ago, and we were hoping to do this last year, but we put it on hold with the pandemic, as we looked at this, is what happens to bats when they're evicted from a home. So this project was in the Ottawa area of Ontario, and we've had a homeowner that had about 110 bats living in their attic that they had hired a wildlife control company to go and do this eviction. And this is a reputable company. They were doing it humanely and at the right time of year. And so we kind of piggybacked on that to trap and tag a bunch of these bats when they were leaving the roost site. We also paired that with a bat box right beside the entry point to see if we can, if bats would be encouraged to move over to the bat box that was placed on the side of the house. So we did the netting. We trapped about 45 bats, and 6 of them were outfitted with radio transmitters, and we followed them through radio telemetry over a period of about 2 weeks until the batteries died, and the tags eventually just fall off. It's all done with surgical glue, and they fall off at the end of the lifespan of the tag. So yeah, these are the transmitters. They were done all in a single night. All the bats were outfitted with an armband as well, that if anyone was ever recaptured or re-seen, we could identify that individual as well. And then we tracked them for the period of 2 weeks. We actually tracked them before the eviction was done. So we put up the tags, tracked them for about 4 or 5 days to see their normal patterns. The eviction was carried out, and then we tracked them for another 2 weeks to see what happens. And originally what happened is the bats tried to get back into their original spot. And as you can see in the top left picture, they basically just kind of roosted in the crevice of the area that they can no longer get back into. As you see in the bottom right, or the right-hand picture, this was their entry point that they were at. So we put the bat box on a well-exposed, like sunny spot, as close as possible to the entry and exit point to hopefully encourage the bats to find that right away. And I'll talk about the use of the bat boxes and potential after that. The takeaway after tracking, the orange arrow here is the home, the original roost site where the bats were. And these lines represent different bats and their movement kind of tracked over the period of time. For the first little while, most of the bats actually just stayed in the roost and they actually didn't come out. I think they were a little shaken by the work that was done, and they just kind of stayed put. But a number of them moved, and the farthest one was about 2.5 kilometers. But the kind of the take home is that pretty much all of them went, or all of them did go to another house. We were able to track them to another roost site in another home. Most of them within about 500 meters of the original home. I should mention these are all big brown bats. News to me, big brown bats were actually the most common one now in Ontario and Quebec, because white nose syndrome has caused a decline in little brown bats. I didn't realize they were less common in Nova Scotia, so I'm assuming they were also more common the same way they are here, but they're now the most common ones we have really in Eastern Ontario and South and West Quebec. I should say, and the bat boxes, so we did find during this 2 weeks, we didn't have any use of the bat box. We checked it daily as we were doing our tracking, but I had gone back a couple months later, and there were 2 bats in the bat box making use of it. Out of 100 that were in the house, that isn't a huge number, but I actually wouldn't have expected really too many to be using, if any, to be using the bat box right away, because generally they take time to get used to them. Ideally, I would have liked to put the bat box up, the season before the exclusion was to happen, the eviction was to happen, to allow bats to get used to it. We just didn't have that luxury because we didn't know the site until we were contacted by the company. So yeah, so we got some use of the bat box, and I'm going to go back this coming season to have a look at it again. Which leads us into bat boxes and our bat box program. Now, as I was saying, like when we think about exclusion, if the bat box that's being paired with the exclusion or eviction is not adequate for bats, you're essentially eliminating one habitat, being the roost in the home, assuming that you're providing another adequate habitat. But when you're not, it's almost giving a false sense of conservation action in a sense. So what we're looking at is what are these different designs and how they are used, which ones are occupied, and how they affect survival and physiology of bats. And as we heard a lot about a whole bunch of different species of bats, generally in bat boxes in Canada, and same thing goes for bats that might be found in people's homes or attics or buildings. The most common ones would be the big brown, well, it shouldn't be big brown myotis, it should be big brown bat, and the little brown myotis. Those are the two most common ones we'd see. To a lesser degree, we'd see the Yuma myotis and northern myotis potentially, but they're less commonly using bat boxes. So our bat box program, as it says in a nutshell, is essentially a guide and an initiative to allow people to build, install, give guidance on installing, and then taking the next step into monitoring and reporting on the bat box use. With this in mind, we can look at the different designs of bat boxes and compile which ones are being occupied, relate that to the placement and where they're installed, and get a sense of which bat boxes are maybe better to recommend. So the building aspect, there's, as I mentioned, so many different styles and designs of bat boxes, and not everybody is capable or interested in building a bat box. There's a lot on the market. The problem with a lot of the ones on the market, I personally think, is they're not big enough. Generally, bigger is better, and a lot of the ones on the market are just a little bit too narrow. And generally, more chambers are better. So I would recommend generally 2 chambers or more. The dark in color to attract more heat. Bats really like it quite hot, especially maternity roosts. Pregnant females really need that extra temperature, and obviously non-toxic materials, meaning from the paints, but also the wood as well that's used to build the bat box. Something else I was going to say about the designs, but it just escaped me, so I'll continue on. For building, if you're interested in building your own bat boxes, I kind of flipped through that quickly, but helpthebats.ca has design plans right from like the specs on the wood that you need to buy, the sizing, how much to cut, and the assembly. So if you're ever interested in taking that on yourself, we have that there. It's a 2-chamber bat box, but it could be kind of added more layers to make it more than that if ever is interested. And the install, we have a guide as well on how to install bat boxes, so I won't get into all the specifics, but generally the research out there is showing that on a building is really the best spot that could be put. And if there's a roost in the building, as close as possible to the entry and exit point is best. A pole is okay. Generally, we recommend not to put it on a tree, just because for one, it's often shaded. Bats need it more sunny and hot, generally. But also the branches kind of impede sometimes the bats from either finding it or access to the bat box. As a rule of thumb, higher is generally better to a certain degree. Generally, we'd say at minimum 12 to 16 feet off the ground. As I mentioned, clear access and exposure to the sun. So ideally a south-facing wall or south-facing mounted on a pole that's south-facing. And the next step is we're considering we're trying to encourage people to monitor their bat boxes that they have installed. We want to know, even if your bat box isn't used, because that information still informs us on the non-use of bat boxes, and is it the design, is it the placement, and we can kind of that helps feed into the information on our bat box study. I'm not going to get into the whole monitoring protocol, but we have one on helpthebats.ca. One thing I would suggest is to check during the daytime if you can, if you have access, to look up from the ground up into the box with a light, a pretty good light, but not spend too much time with it because you don't want to disturb the bat. So a quick check with the flashlight. I wouldn't do, if there's bats present, I wouldn't do it more than like, once a month kind of thing, because we don't want to disturb them. And then check the monitoring protocol, have a look at that first before you plan to set out. And pick a nice, clear, calm night with minimal winds, no precipitation, and then set up at the box below, set up kind of near the base of the bat box. And this goes for any roost actually as well. Kind of a bit before sunset, and grab yourself a chair and a beer, bring the kids out to watch the bats come out, and essentially count the bats as they leave. And then reporting, we have a project on iNaturalist Canada, iNaturalist.ca, called Help the Bats as well within there. And you can report the use of your bat box there. But you can also join a national study that we've launched, and we're launching this year. We had a pilot project. We have about 150 bat boxes up in the Ottawa area of 2 different designs. So we're comparing the 2 different designs. But what we're doing next is getting data loggers sent out to interested participants to install in their bat boxes. These loggers will record temperature and humidity, and those that are interested to take guano samples, as well as a swab we can test for white nose syndrome in the bat boxes. And that way we can put all that information together and have a sense and get a really good picture of the species present, the effects that the microclimate has in relation to the bat box occupancy, and how many bats there would be, as well as bat physiology and reproduction through emergence counts. That would be all kind of combined together with this information. And we're looking at doing this at a national scale and getting participants from across the country, and we can kind of cater bat box recommendations and guidelines based on regionally specific climate conditions. And with that, that's probably a real quick run through with that project, and I will leave you with this thought.
Thank you, James. I wanted to say James has been a mentor for our program, and all of the boxes that we are building, Annapolis Valley Bat Box Project, are built to the standards on the CWF website. And I've popped that diagram into the chat in case anybody's interested in boxes. So thank you, James. And our next speaker is Kate Rugroden. Kate is sorry, I just realized I have the old bio that I got before I got the bio from you. Sorry. Kate is that's what I grabbed off the website before you sent me your bio. I'm going to read this, sorry. Kate is a business systems analyst / project manager with both undergraduate and graduate degrees in IT management, and she's a licensed wildlife rehabilitator specializing in bats, raccoons, and opossums. She's also the director of the Bat World Mid-Cities Rescue Center in Arlington, Texas. And in addition, she's the chair of the Stakeholders Committee for the National White Nose Syndrome Response Team, and is the community representative for the University of Texas Arlington's Institutional and Animal Care and Use Committee. We welcome you, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to join you all the way from Texas. Let me get my screen share up here so you can see what we're going to do, and kind of flip things around. Come on. Okay, and switch this around. There we go. So I have a little different take on things. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a researcher. I'm a wildlife rehabilitator, and that means that I do very different things with bats. I spend most of my time with bats, taking care of them. I treat orphaned, ill, and injured bats that come in that need a little bit of help to get back out and do the job they were born to do out in the real world. But I want to talk a little bit about separating fact from fiction, because there's a lot of misinformation about bats in the media and just in our general perception of what bats are all about. One of the questions I get most often is why bats? Because I could rehabilitate bunnies or I could foster kittens and everybody would understand that because they're cute and they're fuzzy and everybody loves bunnies and kittens. But bats are the only mammals that are capable of powered flight. They have the ability to move in places that no other mammal can go. They represent roughly 20% of all the mammal species on Earth. And they're responsible for pollinating or protecting plants like corn, cotton, bananas, mango, coffee, and chocolate. And quite frankly, if we don't have coffee and chocolate, life is not worth living. So bats are really important. What do we think we know about bats? Based on what the media tells us, bats are creepy, blind, blood-sucking rodents of the night. They're flying rats that will attack you for no reason, and they'll fly into your hair and set up housekeeping there. And I want to take a few minutes to look at why those things aren't really true. But first, here's a little bit of what I do. I take care of orphaned, ill, and injured. So for example, in the month of June, which is baby bat season here, I might see 75 to 100 bats, just like this one right here, that's labeled Eastern Red Bat Pup number 1. That's about a 3-day-old baby bat. It weighs perhaps 2 grams. And it will have to be fed 5 to 6 times a day until it gets to be several weeks old. It won't open its eyes until it's at least 10 days old. And it will live in an incubator until it's big enough to start transitioning off of milk formula. This is a hoary bat. He came in with a wing injury and he was not able to be released, so he joined my permanent colony. And these bats position themselves like this. There are actually 7 bats representing 6 different species in this image. I have 2 Seminole bats, which is this one and this one, a hoary bat, a Mexican freetail, an evening bat, a northern yellow bat, and right back here, these 2 little points that are sticking out behind the Seminole bat are the ears of a tricolor. And they all get along actually quite well. I have several different species that live together, and they get along better than most people do.
Hi, Kate.
Hi, Kate. One
Yeah.
second. I think you're sharing yours, we can't see your full screen. Your slide is slightly cut.
Okay,
Or
let me
in the next
see
slide.
I
if
think,
can-
sorry.
That's okay. Is that better?
Perfect.
Yes, this is great.
Awesome.
All right,
Go
thank
ahead,
you.
Kate, Lori.
Sorry,
Okay.
great.
All right, so I took this video right after a big brown bat that was in my care gave birth to a baby, and she's washing her infant. These are the kinds of things that I get to see as a rehabilitator that researchers and other folks don't get to see. The baby was born on May 15th, a couple of years ago at about 10:30 in the morning. And if you can hear the chirping sound, that's her telling her mom all about how she's not too thrilled with this bath that she's getting. She was a single. Normally I see twins in big brown bats. She was quite a large baby though. She weighed about 6 grams at birth, and I actually ended up having to assist in her delivery because mom had a little trouble getting her out. The mother had a chronic inflammation condition that left her unable to fly, but we were able to release the baby successfully. So that was, and it's really an extraordinary experience to be part of these kinds of things when we're talking about wild animals that are letting us into their lives and things that most people just never see. I spend a lot of my time, let me back that up. That's not supposed to be there yet. This one. Okay. I spend a lot of my time feeding baby bats, especially in the summertime. And these are evening bat babies that I'm feeding. I'm using the foam tip from an eyeshadow applicator as a nurser for them because they're so tiny. This baby is more than 10 days old, but an adult evening bat only weighs about 1/3 of an ounce. So if we think of it in terms of like a sliced, it was weigh about 1 ounce. And so this baby bat, he's about 2 ounces, but an adult evening bat is going to be about 1/3 of a slice of cheese. And he's still learning how to take that to nurse run. It takes a lot of time and patience to make that. Custom make our milk replacing formula. There's not a package or I can just go get. I have to custom mix the formula specifically for each species. But once he sometimes I get maybe too small and it's too small to get, but to a white glove. And so I just saturate the glove with formula and they'll nurse from that. This baby is less than 2 grams. Once he's done, he gets a bath. We have to remove any of the formula that got on the skin to keep him clean and healthy. And his mother would do the same. She would spend a lot of time grooming and keeping her baby clean. And this is probably the most extraordinary experience I've had as a rehabilitator. This is another evening bat. That's not what I wanted it to do. There. She came in with a wrist injury, and it then became apparent that she came with more than just a wrist injury. Once we determined that she was pregnant, she was being hand-fed twice a day initially, and once we determined that she was pregnant, she started being fed 3 times a day. She actually delivered her first baby in my hand. And the fact that she trusted me to do that was really remarkable. Most wild animals do this sort of thing in secret. People don't ever, you don't ever see it. And I'm not sure if there's ever been any other instance of a microbat delivering like this that's been captured on film. Notice though how she's using her tail membrane to support the pup as it emerges. She would be up in a roost, hanging head up, which is reversed from their normal position as she's delivering that baby. She doesn't want the baby to just fall out and hit the ground, so she uses her tail to catch it. And she's a small bat. As I said, she would weigh about 1/3 of an ounce when she's not pregnant. But you see the size of the baby compared to the size of the mother. It's important to understand this was the first of 2. She had twins. And the average birth weight for an insectivorous bat pup is roughly for the total number of babies combined is roughly 25 to 30% of the mother's weight. In human terms, that's a 120-pound woman giving birth to a 30 to 40-pound infant. So they are remarkable, and they're very devoted mothers. She moved off of my hand. We'll see the baby moving here in a moment. You'll see him moving his wings, and he pokes his head out and he fusses at her a little bit. She then went on into this little mesh hut that I was keeping her in and delivered the second baby. It took her about 20 minutes total to deliver both of them. And her babies were successfully released when they were full grown. So, some of the old wives' tales that we hear about bats. As we all know, because we watch movies and we see, things on television, we read books, vampire bats are found throughout the world: Europe, Africa, India, Asia, and North and South America. This is what we learn from the media. The truth is they're only found in Central and South America. Of the 1,400 or so species of bats that exist in the world today, 70% eat insects, about 29% feed on fruit and nectar, and the remaining 1% are the carnivorous bats that eat fish and frogs, occasionally other bat species, and vampire bats. There are 3 species of vampire bats, and they're all in Central and South America. They're actually kind of cute if you look at the baby vampire bats, and they're roughly the size of a hamster. So they're very tiny. They don't attack people. Of the 3 species, 2 of them feed primarily on birds. The 3rd species, which is the common vampire bat, feeds on other mammals, such as cattle, goats, sheep, pigs, and monkeys. And occasionally they will take human blood, generally if they cannot get anything else. They're very easily frightened away, so they won't stick around and make an issue of it. Some more old wives' tales that we hear: all bats carry rabies. The truth is that less than 0.5% of bats are infected with rabies, and in most cases, bats have an innate immunity to the virus. It's transmitted through direct contact between infected saliva or nerve tissue and blood or mucous membranes. That means a bite or a scratch from an infected animal is the only reliable way for the rabies virus to be transmitted. Being near a bat does not constitute exposure. Contact with bat fur, urine, feces, or blood does not constitute rabies exposure. And touching an object that was touched by a bat does not constitute rabies exposure. We often hear that bats are flying mice, but they are no more closely related to rodents than humans are. They belong to their own order, as Hugh pointed out, which is Chiroptera, and that means hand wing. If you look at the shape of the wing, you see the thumb and the 4 fingers. This is the wrist right below the thumb, the forearm, there's an elbow, an upper arm, and a shoulder. And if you look at the skeletal structure of a bat compared to a human, other than the length of some of the bones and the slightly different width between the shoulders and the hips, they're remarkably similar. So who are these old wives we keep hearing from anyway? These are stories that we hear that nobody remembers the origins of. We learn that bats are blind, but actually most bats see as well as humans do. Fruit bats see in full spectrum color, so they can identify fruit, not that is just ready to go to market, but the fruit that got missed and is overripe. They're actually helping protect that fruit crop from fruit flies. Bats are nocturnal and their eyesight is adapted to low light, similar to the way cats see things. Another myth is that bats will fly deliberately into your hair, get caught, and build a nest. Insect-eating bats, we know, use echolocation to navigate in the dark. They hunt tiny flying insects like moths, hundreds to thousands of feet up in the sky at speeds as fast as 60 miles an hour. And to do that without the use of echolocation would be impossible. They are such agile flyers that, as we've seen, engineers are attempting to build helicopters, drones, and airplanes that fly the way bats do, that move the way they do, because they're so skilled at maneuvering in tight spaces, turning quickly, flipping up and upside down. They're very acrobatic in the sky at night. So what about bats and rabies? Based on extensive research, the CDC estimates that less than 0.5% of all bats is infected with rabies, and bats do not carry rabies. They're not all harboring rabies, just waiting to give it to somebody. Rabies exposure requires direct contact between infectious saliva or nervous tissue and blood or mucous membranes, which means a bite or a scratch from an infected animal that is shedding the virus. And the bottom line here is that if you protect bats, protect yourself by never touching a bat or really any wild animal barehanded, you have zero risk of contracting rabies. You can't get rabies from a piece of fruit that a bat licked. You cannot get rabies from a bat that flew near you. You cannot get rabies from a bat from touching an object that may have been touched by a bat. You cannot get rabies from bat urine, guano, blood, or fur. And you cannot get rabies from a water source where a bat took a drink. It's disappointing, I know, but Bat Boy is not real. Bats don't lay eggs. They give birth to live young and they nurse their young. And the real Count Dracula did not turn into a bat. Bats are not portents of death. Seeing a bat flying in the sky does not mean that you're going to die. Bat guano will not make you crazy. And mascara and eyeliner are not made from bat guano. I know that the question comes up in every presentation that I do. Well, what about bats and coronavirus, COVID-19? The fact is that bats harbor a number of viruses, including SARS-CoV-2 in some cases. It is not true that bats typically directly transmit viruses to humans. It is a fact that one or more unrelated other species are involved in virus transmission most of the time. It is not true that North American bats carry the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It is a fact that human contact with wildlife increases our risk of exposure to new viruses. It is not true that wild animals are to blame for human viral infections. And it is a fact that wild animals do not seek out contact with humans. Where did SARS-CoV-2 come from? To the best of our knowledge, based on the research that's been done, granted in a very short time span, the SARS-CoV-2 virus most likely originated in the Asian horseshoe bat. These bats were sold as a delicacy at an Asian live market in Wuhan, China. Think farmers market with livestock, and that's what a live market is. The bats were housed in close proximity to other live, wild, and domestic animals. And the virus mutated about 40 to 70 years ago, which enabled it to jump to another species from the bats. This is the bat that is believed to be the reservoir for SARS-CoV-2. It's called the Asian or Rufus horseshoe bat. And it's a medium-sized insect-eating bat that's common to China, India, Nepal, and Vietnam. It is not known to exist anywhere else in the world. The Rufus horseshoe bat is considered a delicacy in some parts of Asia. People eat them. And like many wildlife species, they may also be used in traditional medicinal remedies. How did it get into people? Well, direct transmission of viral pathogens from bats to people is rare. We have not yet identified the intermediate species in the COVID-19 outbreak. Some research suggests that it may be the Asian, one of the Asian species of pangolin, but we don't know that for sure. The introduction of a new virus into humans is called a spillover, and historically there have been a large number of spillover events where diseases emerge into the human population. Most of them have not had the devastating effect that SARS-CoV-2 has had, but historically also our ability to travel the globe in short periods of time in large numbers is a fairly new event. It's only been in the last 100 or so years that we've been able to move around the globe so quickly and in large numbers to transmit disease. But the bottom line here is that as we continue to interfere with wild animals and their habitats, we increase our risk of disease. We persist in going places we should not go, doing things we should not do. And having not learned the lesson of Pandora's box, we keep opening that box expecting to find cookies. But there are things that we can do to help bats. We can make things better. Put up a bat house or two, depending on what your situation is, how much room you have, what your landscape looks like. Put up at least one bat house, and don't forget the pup catcher, which is a piece of netting that extends below the bottom of the bat house and projects forward a little bit, so a bat that falls from the bat house can catch itself on that netting and climb back up in instead of falling to the ground and needing to go to a rehabber. Take care when you're pruning or removing trees to make sure there are no bats roosting there, because bats can be injured when a tree branch gets pruned. If that's in the way, the bat will be hurt. You can plant native plants instead of invasive ornamentals, because native bugs love native plants and native bats love native bugs. They will eat those bugs for you if you will plant a garden that attracts them. And most importantly, spread the word about bats, because education is critical. We fear what we don't know and what we don't understand. And if we learn about bats, we try to understand bats. We might be a little less afraid of them. We don't have to all love them, but we should at least not be afraid of them and be respectful of their right to exist and do what they were born to do, which is to help us by eating insects and pollinating and propagating plants that we rely on. And with that, I will turn it back over to our hosts.
Thank you so much, Kate. Especially these days, it's so important to separate fact from fiction. So we're really glad you got a chance to do that. I'd like to give big thanks to all of our speakers who made this event possible. I'd like to let everybody know we are now moving into the question and answer portion of the webinar. If anybody has any questions for any of our speakers, please either raise your hand or we can just put something in the chat there, whatever you like, and we'll try to get to you.
And as Zach said earlier, everybody, just remember, if you'd like to support bats by having a bat box in your property, please contact us. I'll put our info in the chat again, and we can get the process started. And also, please remember to fill out our survey, which you can find in the comments section of the chat in a minute once I post it. Thank you. So yeah, so just
Richard,
any questions, raise your hand, or sure, Jane, take it away.
do you know how to put my picture on here?
That's your problem. I'm doing the chat.
I don't think we could do it on our end, Jane, but we can hear you. Do you have a question?
I can hear you. Did you have a question?
Hello, I was just going to get my picture up. It doesn't matter. I want to say hello to the lady who just talked from Bat World. Back in the 90s, I ran an organization on environmental education and humane rights for humane education for children. And I found out everybody loved dogs and cats and bunnies. So I took the angle, well, I'm going to teach them to like a few things that most people don't like, because I did like bats. On it went. But anyway, I was in touch with, is it Amanda Lawler who founded the?
She's still with us.
She even wrote a little story for my newsletter at the time. So I want you to thank her if she remembers me.
I certainly will.
And I was in touch with them. I was also in touch with BCI because it was the organization that everything. And I actually did go down and meet Merlin Tuttle. We went up and visited my husband and I and had a long talk with him. So it was really, really interesting. And in New Brunswick, I did a fair amount of education and trying to teach people to respect bats in particular, because everybody went icky when you mentioned bats. And so on. So I'm glad a lot of people are out there still carrying on. I'm too old to carry on now, but I certainly stick up for bats whenever I can. So thank you, Kate, and thank you, Kirsten, and thank you, James, and everybody else. It was great.
Thank you so much.
We have a question. Oh, two things. First thing is I realized we haven't gone over how to raise your hand, because if you just lift up your hand manually, there's many participants who may not be able to see it. But there is an option to raise your hand if you go into participants, or else just put in the chat that you would like to unmute yourself and speak. We had a question earlier from Liz and Jeff. Do bats maintain a family or specific social group during their lives? If somebody would like to answer that.
I can jump in on that one. This is Kate. Bats do form social groups. They're called colonies. Or cave dwelling. Tree roosting bats are much more solitary, and we see mothers with pups, but we rarely see adult males and females roosting together unless it's breeding season. Baby season, both males and females roosting. During baby season, guys all go to the man roost. They have no role in raising the moms will hang out together and they'll put their babies in a maternity roost to keep them warm and safe while mom is out hunting.
Thank you, Kate. Do you have any other questions in the chat here?
John B is wondering if the Bat Box project has geographic limitations. And so
John, that depends entirely on where you are and
Digby.
Yeah, no, if it's Digby, we can arrange something, maybe meet halfway to bring the Bat Box to you. And we do have some volunteers who may be heading out that way. If that's the case, we can unload the Bat Box on them and they could bring it your way. If you contact us, though, we're more than willing to work something out there. And that goes for anybody who's interested in a Bat Box. Let us know and we'll see what we can do. Thanks.
Does anybody else have any questions for any of our speakers?
Oh,
I
yeah.
have a question if I may ask it.
For sure.
This is Soren. And this question is primarily for you, Kate. I used to work with Kay McKeever at the Owl Rehabilitation Research Foundation. And she also raised owl youngs from the individuals she could not release. And she discovered that she had to teach those young how to hunt before she could release the owlets. So I'm just wondering if bat young, do they know how to hunt and feed automatically, or would they have to be taught how to do that?
That's a really good question. Thank you. Fortunately, baby bats instinctively know how to hunt insects because I'm not capable of flying and I wouldn't be able to catch a bug for them and teach them how to do it themselves. So they do actually hunt instinctively. We know this. We have evidence of it. We've marked our orphans and released them, had them come back with the marking still on them that we can see. We've had a couple of instances where they came back as adults and had clearly lived multiple years, migrating back and forth, moving from roost to roost. Both of the instances that come to mind immediately were females. It was evident that they had had babies. So they were very successful. One of them was 13 or 14 years old when she came back. She actually came home to die. She died of old age the second time she came into care. The first time she came in was as a baby. But she remembered the routine. She remembered her caregiver, and she knew she was in a safe place when it was time for her to go.
Excellent. Thanks so much. That's good to know.
Thank you, Kate. Next, we have a question from Kirby here. It says, I'm wondering if anyone knows anything about bats in salt marshes in Nova Scotia. Tidal marshes host a variety of insects, particularly mosquitoes, and are often bordered by forests. However, they would rarely be near caves or abandoned mines. Does anyone know whether or not bats would use a salt marsh as a habitat, as a hunting ground? Does anybody want to take a stab at that?
I could take that one if you wish.
Absolutely, go ahead.
So I've worked throughout Nova Scotia and in a number of areas that were adjacent to salt marshes, and we've done a bunch of tracking individual animals and tagging them and following them. The evidence I have that suggests that they do comes though from a type of analysis we do that's called stable isotope analysis. Basically what we're doing is we're sampling the tissues of the animals, and we're looking for different isotopes of carbon in those tissues. And in relation to carbon isotopes, you are what you eat. And so if there's environmental variation in relation to carbon isotopes across space, you might be able to pick that up in the tissues of the animals that you're sampling. So for example, I've sampled in places like the Eastern Shore and down around Annapolis Royal and places like that. And I've picked up carbon isotope signatures in the tissues of the bats that suggest they're feeding out over salt marshes or along the shoreline, places like that. So it wouldn't really matter that they're not near caves or abandoned mines, because the animals around Nova Scotia, for the most part, are only near those sites beginning about the 10th of August, plus or minus a few days. That's when they begin leaving the summering grounds and congregating around the entrances of caves and abandoned mines. And prior to that, they're spread all over the landscape. So just a little bit back to the question that Soren had about learning to feed and that sort of thing. Kate answered it beautifully. But the other thing I would add there is a little bit of context. And in parts of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, some of these young are not born until the 20th of July, which I bet for our colleagues here in Texas would seem to be remarkably late. And it's even late for some areas in New England, for example. But these animals are sometimes giving birth the third week in July. And by about the 10th, 12th, 13th of August, they're leaving maternity roosts. It takes a young bat about 3 weeks to learn to fly. So if you do the math on that, they're cutting everything incredibly close. And although they don't start hibernating by the middle of August, they have left the maternity roosts, and they do need to be able to feed, need to be able to put on weight, and they need to be able to find out where and how to hibernate. So the challenges associated with being a young bat are, they're incredible. Which is why they're fascinating as well.
Thank you, Hugh. So if we have any more questions, guys, feel free to just...
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, the chat is disabled and I cannot find the hand raising option. Sorry, thank you, Dr. Broders, for answering my question about bats and salt marshes. My next follow-up question to that is, are those data published, and can you send it to me?
Yeah, we've got a couple of papers. I can send, if you reach out to me by email, Kirby, I can.
What is your email address?
Sorry?
Or was that made available earlier, I should say, before I start asking you to just spout off your email?
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
No problem.
There's a bit of a problem with the chat. It's disabled on my end, and Kirby just said it's disabled as well. Is anybody else able to use it?
Actually, yeah, I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Oh yeah, Cameron,
No,
go ahead.
Cameron.
Hey, Darren. Anyways, I have a question. In my region, I live in Western Canada, so there's like tons of trees, and I live in a heavily forested area. Would I benefit the bat population if I made a bat box?
Take that one as well if you wish. To me, bat boxes serve multiple purposes. People ask me all the time if they should put up a bat box, and the first thing I say is yes. And for nothing else, they're great conversation pieces. You're sitting on your back deck, you're having a beer, you're having a barbecue, your friends are over, what's that in the tree? And you start up a conversation about what's going on. And it's a great tool for education, for discussion, breaking down these myths that there are about these animals. So even if you don't get any bats, at the very least, there's education and stewardship benefits there. If there's lots of trees around and lots of houses around, the animals may have lots of alternative roosting sites, and realize that these animals are social, long-lived, and they remember things. Bats in my neighborhood, I'm pretty sure they know where every crack and crevice and attic is where they can go to roost. So it'll depend upon the environment that you're in. So for example, in places in Scandinavia where there aren't a lot of like natural forest with a lot of snags, a lot of structures, bat boxes tend to be used more readily there than would be a natural undisturbed forest here in Canada, for example. But so it depends. And it won't hurt to put them up, and it's a great conversation piece. And it's possible that you may get bats, but don't be disappointed if you don't.
Yeah,
Can I add
to that? Oh, do you want to go, Kirsten?
No, you go for it.
Yeah, I totally echo that. I agree exactly with the conversation piece, and that's part of our project as well, is raising awareness through bat boxes. And we totally understand that bat boxes aren't used all the time. The other thing I'd mention, especially in the face of white nose syndrome, I kind of call it a buyer's or renter's market. The populations are so low that they kind of have their choice of places to go. So for the most part, an attic or a barn or structure provides more diversity of habitat within the structure itself, and the bats don't have to leave to then find to thermoregulate to find the different temperatures. So honestly, an attic is more ideal for a bat than a bat house, but they do get used. So yeah, I would agree with all that.
Yeah, and to add one more thing with Corey Lawson has done a lot of great work with bat houses, and she kind of has this great idea of a community of roosts, right? So it's not just one roost that bats use. A lot of times bats do move around a bit. So even if they have currently enough roosts on the landscape, it can't really hurt to put more out there. Because they do move around. You know, if something happens to one of their other roosts, that might give them another option. So it's kind of a community thinking, not just, one roost.
And they do move from roost to roost on a day-to-day basis. Like we talk about a maternity roost and there's 100 there, but the 100 that are there today could be very different from the 100 that are there tomorrow, because they do a whole lot of mixing. And speaking of microclimates, tonight it might be cold and wet, and a particular type of roost might be suitable. And tomorrow the weather is different. And so they have to select different microclimates for their roost depending upon the time of year and their own physiology, whether they're pregnant or they're lactating or whatever the case may be. So variety is good.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we do have another question from Douglas. We have, we would like to install bat box. However, the wall faces east. It gets a lot of early morning sunlight up until noon, 1 p.m. Will this be sufficient?
Yeah, I could jump in on that as well. I mean, in our guidelines, we typically say if it can get, at least kind of 8 hours of sunlight a day is ideal, 8 or more. I mean, you could kind of have a look and see how long the sun hits that east wall. But I think that would be okay. I think a main part too is to consider, is it in the shade? If it's south facing and shaded by a tree, you probably are better off with an east facing wall that's more exposed to the sunlight.
Thanks, James.
Just advancing that a little bit more though, just so you know, like I know of bat boxes that are on north, south, east, and west facing places, and they all have bats in them. So I don't know why they choose here or there, that sort of thing. And all these recommendations are really good, but if you're stuck with a situation where it needs to be on an east facing wall, go for it, I would say.
Perfect, thanks.
Thank you. So does anybody have any more questions? Karen Lively, I see you're holding up your hand. Do you want to speak?
Yes, I'd like to speak. My question is about the bat poop. Now, is that not toxic? I have a small dog on the property, and I think, it would probably land on the peak of my porch roof, but I mean, what happens at that point? Like, is that a bit of concern on my property?
Yeah, perfect. Does anybody want to tackle that one?
I can give it a go if you want. So I don't think there's a concern. So where are you? Sorry, Karen?
I'm in the city. I'm in HRM neighborhood.
Okay, you're in Halifax.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you've got bats in HRM, you've got little brown bats, almost certainly. You don't have big brown bats there, and the other species that it probably wouldn't be is northern long-eared bats, and they wouldn't be in the city either. So you've got little brown bats, and I would not worry about anything in relation to bat droppings along your property and it being dangerous for your dogs or whatever the case may be. If I was in a personal situation where I had hundreds of bats in my attic, I'd probably want to keep it cleaned out just because of smell and that sort of thing. But we don't know of any, there's no known issues that we have with guano of bats in relation to problems for your dog or yourself or that sort of thing. Especially if it's only small numbers. And how many, you probably don't have hundreds of bats there, do you?
No. There used to be bats on the property when I bought the house like about 17 years ago, but I haven't seen any. And I did actually purchase bat boxes for my family because they were in Cape Breton, and there were bats there at that time. So that was when white nose was happening, and I haven't seen any, but I know the mosquitoes are, more than they used to be for sure. Right. So I would like to get a bat box and put it in the eave of my house, and it is south facing. I think it would be ideal. So that was my concern though. Okay, thank you.
There may still be individuals around that were part of that group before white nose, and they may still know about your attic.
No, they weren't in my attic. They were like, you could see them on the property, like just swooping by.
Oh, okay.
Many years ago, like when, but I haven't seen them in years, right? So. Yeah.
I would suggest, if you're thinking with a bat box too, that ties into Kate's mention of planting native plants, is if you can put it in a place where you can plant some shrubs.
Whatever the case may be, is there something else that would be helpful to do, maybe in like a less permanent way, or and I know someone mentioned planting native plants. Would that be something helpful to do?
I can take that, because I'm still renting, so I just graduated with my PhD, and I I've been renting forever, so I have never owned a house, and I have a rental that's in an HOA now, so you can imagine I definitely can't put up a bat house. So it's definitely my dream to do that, but I think some of the things that we can do is, you know, if you have a garden or if you have a garden bed, you can definitely plant those night blooming flowers that will attract the nocturnal insects. You know, it's a great, again, a great ecosystem in your own backyard. And a lot of those plants you can plant in a fairly small area, you know, so you can have a bed. One of the things I'm considering in my community is there's a farm right next to our community. And so maybe working with the local farms or, you know, park spaces to put up bat houses. So, you know, even if they're not your bat houses, if you know about bats and can advocate for them, that would be a great way to contribute. So I think there are things you can do even if you're not permanent.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Krista.
Yeah, I'd echo that. In our Ottawa project, we have a few bat boxes that are up in municipal parks, and that was kind of through talking with the city and a couple on schools. So even if, as Kirsten said, if they're not yours, then you can still get one up. And then the bonus of that, I think, would be if you're interested in taking the next step, then you can go and monitor it and report on it. And even if the park or, you know, the municipality would probably just put it up and leave it, which is great, but you can do the next thing and monitor and report on use and engage people that way.
Right. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
We also have a question from Cameron Lulua. Cameron, did you have a question there?
I think that was a previous question. Let me check it. I forget my questions.
That's okay.
I'll get to that, but I also have another question. And thank you for answering my previous question. I'm wondering, is there any bat feeding programs coming around? Because I read recently that if a bat is bigger than usual, or actually fatter, they survive the white nose syndrome.
Yeah, I can take this actually too. For BCI, we have a program that we're initiating called Fat Bat. So it's just like you're saying. It's the idea is to put out ultraviolet lights that will attract insects to these lights that the bats can then feed on as they come out in the night. So yeah, it's something that we're kind of trialing to see if it's going to work. Obviously, you don't want to cause negative consequences from what you do. But yeah, we're trying to fatten them up before they go into hibernation. So yep, stay tuned for that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Cameron.
Yeah. Does anybody have any last questions before we wrap this up? I realize we're going a little more than a little bit over time, so thank you for sticking around. Any last questions?
Don't have any more questions. We do want to thank all of the speakers again one more time. Thank you so much for spending your time. I'm sure everybody appreciates it. I know we do. And I think that just about does it for us. Yeah, I think we should be finishing up. So thank you everybody for showing up tonight. It's been very informative. And do this again soon.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Remember to fill out our survey, contact us if you want a bat box, and take care of bats.
Bye guys.
Thank